Thanks for coming to the integration session, Connecting Element to Anything. I'm Artis Kadu. I'm the founder and CEO of Element451. Today we're going to talk about one of the kind of boring things, but one of the most exciting things for those geeks and technology geeks out there. So how do we connect Element to a lot of the different systems that we use? This is all about integrations and data sharing. We've been talking a lot about integrations throughout the conference. We'll be talking about data sharing throughout the conference. Our goal at Element is to really integrate with everything and make data exchange really available to move data from Element to other systems, to move interactions and have workflows kind of work together with different systems, including the SIS, your SIS systems as well, other components and other data sources, bringing that into Element and also kind of exchanging information with those systems as well. What we're going to touch on today is the agenda is really, it's going to be a little bit flexible. We're going to talk about how we think about it, and we're going to talk about our documentation and kind of the different ways that Element can bring data in and out. And then we're going to touch base on some of the apps and some of the integrations that we already have in Element and kind of how we think about those components. And how we think about the ecosystem. And then the last part that we're going to talk about is really a few use cases, right? A lot of you ask a lot of questions around, well, we have this system, we have that system, have you worked with this, have you worked with that? And I'll kind of show you a couple of examples of how we've worked with different systems and how different components, and a couple of them are really, really interesting. So with that being said, I kind of showed this yesterday during our product kind of keynote, but we've put together a great integration guide which talks a lot about the different aspects of Element, how it integrates. We have the API documentation there. There's some sample code. So rather than kind of talking about it, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but I'm actually going to go in and kind of explore a few of the different areas. I'm going to use that guide as a kind of blueprint for how we think about data exchanges, how we think about data in Element overall. So let me go directly to that. All right. So when you go to integrations, and this is a live guide, a live page that will get updated, as we add more stuff to it. So a few of the things that you're going to notice in here is that we've tried to put in everything that we can think of around integrations or what's useful to you. We have different sections. We've tried to break it down in different sections, things like flat file integrations, what that takes, how to build those things, API integrations. We have some sample code in there. So let's kind of take them one by one and explore really, really quickly what we have in here. So when we look at the API integrations, we're essentially taking a look at how to get data in and out from a programmatic perspective, right? Now, during this session, some of you might be less technical, and some of you might be on the implementation support side that's working with the data team, that's working with Element to integrate it into their own system. So by having this resource and this documentation, it becomes really, really easy for you to come in and say, okay, how do I kind of set up? And of course, we say there is no, Element is a no code platform, but you needed the coding. That's APIs is application programming interfaces, right? So the programming part is really how you're connecting these different systems together. We'll talk about in the second part where we talk about apps and how Element is leveraging other platforms to kind of put the components together. But if you want to get data in and out of Element in a programmatic way, we have made it really, really flexible for you to do that. At the very core of that data is really those import and export templates that we have in Element and we have created in there. So when you go to Element really quickly under our import and export templates, you have the ability in here to essentially build data schemas, so to speak. Actually, let me go to our templates. So we have the ability to build these data schemas and to specify, okay, these are the fields that we want to import and export, right? And these are the fields, and this is kind of how we're going to interface with Element. So we configure them in here, and then we can call these, and we can use them in our APIs in order to send the data back and forth from Element to other systems. So that's kind of the paradigm with Element. Everything is based on our templates, and all of the integrations are based on that on the API side. Now I can go back in here really, on the integration guide really quickly, and I don't want to talk a lot about this just because we can dive into more detail in here, but essentially we provide programmatically a way to use those templates in you can just specify something in the URL to say, okay, use this template to pull data this way, or dynamically you can create a mechanism to pull whatever other pieces of data that you want out of it. All right, so let's move on. So I'm going to move on from the API documentation component, essentially data importing, exporting, how to set up all of that. We have some sample code in there. There's some tips and tricks in here as well on how to build those, how to build those different things. When we talk about the next part we're going to talk about is kind of flat file. When we talk about flat file, is really how do you bring in, you have a file, how do you bring in data? Every system works with CSV files, Excel, whatever other files you want to talk about, but how do you bring that data in from a CSV file to Element, and then how do you export that data from Element to something like that? Well, we've had that for a really long time. Again, it's all based on those templates, right? So you define the schema, and then you can export that data out, and anytime we have everything through our UI that you saw in here. Let's go back here. You saw everything in the UI, and that's how we export and import that. Now, a lot of different vendors and different systems, for example, SAT, ACT, testing scores, Common App, and so on and so forth, have what they say is that, okay, we have our own format, we have our template, right? We have our layout. And based on that layout, you can now guarantee that this is the columns that are going to be in that file that you're receiving. This is those fields that are coming in. This is some of the lookup tables. And then they're giving you some kind of interface documentation for the schemas. So what we've done in Element is that we have actually gone through and said, you know what, we're going to, we have a lot of pre-built templates in there. And the latest ones that we've added are really the SAT, ACT templates. And you have some guides in here as well around those templates. But we've been adding a lot more. If a system has, or if an integration, or if a tool has the ability to give us a layout and say, okay, this is it, this is how it's going to be, then we're providing you with what's called a global template here in Element in order for you to bring that data in. So if I go to templates in here, I can actually search for, you can see them in here, right? So you see ACT and SAT as two of the templates that we've added, and you can see them because they have a different color and different different icon here, and it says import system templates. Now, if you have other sources that you're working with, let us know, and then we'll build more of these predefined templates, so you don't have to do it, right? So then when you can go import a file, you can just say, hey, I'm going to use the SAT template. Hey, I'm going to use the ACT. Oh, hey, I'm going to use this particular vendor template that's coming in. So that's on the flat file component integration. And what we do when we integrate with some of the SIS systems is you might have a particular process that's you've been using for a long time, and you import data in a certain way. An Element can mimic that file that your import process has been using. So when we talk about flat file integration, it's only in the aspect of we can export any type of data in any schema that you want, and then now you have to import that into the SIS, and it does the same thing that way. So the exchange that's happening is a file between our two different systems, and you have to understand like what the layout of that is, and what the values and how those are, how those values can be mapped then internally into the SIS, and how Element can map those internally into Element. So that's the process of that flat file integration. And like I said, we're using it quite a bit for some of the vendors, like test scores or other sources. Obviously, before we had a common application, global template as well. We keep up with that. This year, we have added the ability for Element to be. We have our own. You're probably going to see that an Element template in Common App, so you can pick that. And then you can export that layout, and then we have the matching one on the Element side, so it can be imported very easily. All right, so there's a couple other things in here. If you want to then kind of take a quick deep dive in some of the other kind of integration platforms, but essentially the fundamental way that Element connects or exchanges data is through our templates, and then we make that available either through our APIs, or we make it available through some other flat file exchange, or we're going to talk about how we're using other kind of apps that can integrate, can kind of connect with Element to kind of pull that data or send that data back in. If you didn't attend the Zapier, or if for those of you who are online, if we had a session a little bit earlier on that talked about how we are now, we can connect that through Zapier, and how we can use that in more real time. So I'll go back here. So we talked about a little bit about the flat file approach. We talked a little bit about the API, but then there's other components in here that can really pull data from Element. And they can be a facilitator or a helper platform to kind of bring it and connect it and bring it to some of the other tools in here as well. And those that we used, obviously we talked about Zapier, but then there's a few other ones as well. But here, for example, here's some of the flat files. I guess I missed this one. This slide, but we've created kind of this global templates. We talked about the global templates in here. But here's, we call them integration platforms as a service, right? And we talked about Zapier this afternoon, but we'll take a look at, there's a couple other ones that are really interesting. We don't have apps for them yet, but Make, formerly Integromat, is very similar to Zapier. We talked about Boomi, or this is probably called Dell Boomi. A lot of companies, or probably a lot of your IT departments are using something like this. We have a partnerships with Axiom, and they've been in the higher education space for quite a while, but they're probably in some of your institutions that they're using Axiom, and again, they connect directly to your databases, so they're kind of the glue in between one system and another, right? So they're taking data and they're kind of moving that data aside. Another partner of ours is Link, and of course there's a lot more, right? One of the things that we've done is we've tried to bring a lot of this stuff in-house, right? We've tried to bring a lot of this stuff and these integrations in-house, and we'll show that in just a second. But I wanted to, for those of you who are, I wanted to kind of give another overview of Zapier for those of you who did not attend the earlier session. Zapier makes it really, really easy to kind of be the piping of the internet, so to speak, connecting one application to another. It handles not just the data connections, but it handles not just the transformations or bringing data in and out, but it also handles the authentication to those other systems, right? Because those other systems, like a Google Sheets, for example, you need to log into Google or some other components to it. So, some of this might be familiar, but we do have a full publicly available Zapier app on their website. You can kind of go in, you can just search for it, or you can just find it through their search, or go directly to the URL and see what's available there. It's more real-time triggers. There's a lot of actions, about 7 actions that you can do a lot of things. And again, it uses those schemas and those templates to get things in and out. All right, some of the new integrations that we've been adding, and this is kind of one of the things that I wanted to go in and give some examples of, is talk about the common application integration. I'm not sure how many of you use Common Application, but it's been one of the things we've been working for a while on, and one of the partners of Common App that we had to do a partnership last year, and now we are officially part of their delivery mechanism. So essentially you can say, I want Element to receive all of my applications, all of my data, and then they deliver it to the Element destination. And now we're processing that data, we're bringing it into Element, and we're storing everything in one place so you don't have to do anything, right? And then you can use, again, Element from the other side, we can use that stored data to bring in only the fields that you want, right? So you no longer have to have all these files lying around. We're ingesting all of that data every day when Common App sends it to us, all 2,000 fields, right, for every institution. So we have it all in there, and then you can just pick the 10 or 20 or 30 fields that you want and bring those into Element whenever you need it. So if you want to go back and say, hey, I forgot a field, well, the data is still there. So you can kind of go back and rerun those and import more of that data. So that's kind of the way that we've implemented the Common App integration in Element. You just let us know if when the data, when your team is going to turn that on, or let us know how we can help you to kind of build those custom templates or custom schemas on the data that you want to import. A couple other ones that we've added. We're going to talk about Populi in just a second, but also we've worked a lot with Ethos lately, right? And a lot of you have either some kind of an Ellucian SIS, either banner or colleague, and we're seeing that more and more where Ethos is essentially the API layer that Ellucian has put on top of banner and colleague, so we can get access to the banner data and we can get access to the colleague data and both send data to it and retrieve data from it. It's an API that they have put on top of it to simplify us going directly to the database in a lot of different places. So for example, those iPaaS application or those iPaaS platforms that we saw before, like Axiom, or they essentially go directly to the database, right? A lot of them go directly to the database, and that's really not a modern way of doing data, because there's no data integrity, there's not a lot of security, right? So we care a lot about security. So we want to go through the standard interfaces. We want to go through APIs, and that's what Ethos is. So our team has been working over the past year and a half now, and we have multiple of these integrations done. One of them, Northwest College, their own colleague, they've been using Ethos now for quite a while. We are implementing two more. Wake Tech, it's using Ethos and colleague, and Texas A&M San Antonio, they're using Banner and Ethos as well. So I'm going to show you that in just a second. Anthology, their Campus Nexus product has an API as well, so that's another one. And St. Mary of the Woods, they came to us and said, hey, they have an API, can you guys build an integration for that? And we went ahead and did that, so we integrated. So essentially anything that has an API on the other side, we are coming in and saying we can do an integration with that, and Element will kind of manage it, and we will build that for you. This way it becomes a lot easier for when there's updates and there's changes, then we can be the ones who are managing it rather than having another team in between. We have found that that's worked out well in some cases, but it's a mixed bag, right? It's a mixed bag because data is so integral to everything that you do. All right. So with that being said, I think I'm gonna go to the first one. I'm gonna start from the bottom. So Presidio came to us and their graduate school, and they were on Salesforce, and they said, you know what? We're moving away from Salesforce, so we're moving to Element. And they had a consultant come in, and they had done a lot of integrations in Salesforce's I forget what the Apex coding, or I forget their layer there, but essentially a lot of customization and coding to build workflows around students and kind of integrating, like kicking off certain processes in other systems. We saw it first and we're like, okay, so we should be able to do this. Populi has an integration, but then as we dive a little bit deeper, like there's more and more kind of components that they needed, and not everything was kind of wired, the right way. And there's certain components in there that they had to do things manually if they failed, so there was not a lot of visibility in terms of the integration. They didn't know how things were happening. So we came in, and what we did there, we worked with them to basically have a Populi integration with Element through the Populi APIs, but then we also worked with them to essentially, as soon as somebody from Element was sent to Populi, we also needed to create a Google account for them because they're a Google school. So it actually created a presidio.edu account on Google. It created a Zoom account for that person on Zoom because now they have virtual classes as well. We needed to create, on Google, we needed to create a group for particular classes. So essentially it was creating groups and then putting people in those groups and then assigning them to Zoom. So the workflow there was pretty intense, right, in terms of what we needed to do. So it was essentially automating the whole onboarding process of that student, all the account creation and everything. Now, they don't have a lot of resources on the other side, so a lot of these pieces were kind of adding more and more
components as we're going along, but it just became quite a bit of an integration. So one of the things that I can show you is you're using, as a product team, we're kind of jumping on, our philosophy has been like, open is always better, right? Open is always better. So if there is something that is in open source, and if it's something that it's a platform that it's more open than others, like those are the things that we're trying to adopt, right? Zapier has been, of course, they've been growing really fast. We jumped on it really earlier on, pretty good. But we're adopting a lot of open source tools. I think Damien was showing you before some of the graphs around our data components, and we're using a product called DBT, which is really like allows us to model a lot of the data in there. We're using an orchestration product called Daxter right now. It's an open source. It's Python based, so essentially it allows us to do a lot of the orchestration, and I'll show you that in just a second. But it's open source, right? So next year or whatever, you want to say, you know what, all this integration that you did, if your team wants to kind of take it on and kind of maintain it and do their own thing, it's like, well, okay, here it is. It's open source, right? So it's not locked into any particular tool. You don't have to rebuild it, right? We've done that already for you. So I wanted to show you really quickly kind of what that looks like, because let's see. All right, so here is that Presidio application, right? So here's that Presidio kind of graph. And when we look at this, we wanted to have visibility and we wanted to have repeatability in how we're making this integration. So essentially every block is kind of a different operation, and we're kind of tying things together so we have visibility on it when data goes through, and I'll show you that in just a second. But what we've done here is essentially you're like, okay, we're extracting data. Of course, we can kind of dive deeper into that. There's a lot of kind of tasks that we're doing. We're exporting the student, we're finding or creating a new student, and so on and so forth. So we're kind of labeling them, and we're doing this in a very straightforward way, all right? So you know exactly what's going on here. So when you look at this, is extracting the data, we're updating demographic data, we're kind of updating application data, we're checking if student is admitted. There might be some conditions in there that are holding that off, and then we're kicking off the admitted, like if a student is admitted, then we're kicking off some other tasks and properties, some workflows in there. So if I explode this one, you can see the different components and kind of the different graphs of how that data is orchestrated, all those pieces of data moving moving along and how we're kind of connected those together. Now, think about this as like little pieces of the puzzle, because when we work with an API, when we work with Colleague, for example, or we work with Ethos, we've abstracted a lot of that work. So the more schools that we work with, the better we are at templatizing and repeating kind of these patterns. So we can take literally like hours and days to put these pieces together rather than taking 6 months or a year, because we have to build everything from scratch over and over again. So that's kind of how we're taking the approach here. And of course, we're building on open source tools. We can integrate this with Element and essentially expose a lot of these now in our, and that's kind of the vision here, right? So when you look at this, you're going to see things like, okay, check if student is admitted. If the student is admitted, it says admitted student, create, let's see. So it's creating different, it's running Zoom integration here, right? And of course you can see that there is visibility in how many times this thing have run. There's transparency in when they ran. You can actually see the results in here. You can kind of see the graphs of everything, kind of when they ran, how long they ran. So we have a history here. It's like a history of failure, a history of, how often things have happened. So we have all this data in here, and we can kind of kick off things again over and over. So the visibility on this, it's pretty amazing what we've been able to do, or what some platforms like Daxter, for example, gives us the ability to do, because they're kind of next generation data orchestration tools, right? These are being used now for a lot more than just orchestrating like very simple data pipelines. They're now connecting to multiple things. And the way that we're also using this to connect to other components is when we're using a component, or we're using a platform called Make, because at the end of the day, we said, okay, we can go and call the APIs of Google and Zoom and all of these other things, but then we have to maintain things like integration, not just integrations, but we have to become an app on Google, right? So Google needs to give our app access, or we need to have a Zoom app, or which we do. But all of these platforms, there's hundreds and thousands, well, not hundreds, but thousands and thousands of them, right? And because they all have their authentication, it becomes a lot harder for us to become, it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? It's like all of our time. We don't want to be an integration platform. We want to integrate with everything. So essentially, we're using Make to kind of build some of that work that is not necessarily around the data component, right? So what we're doing here is we're using Make to say, okay, here's a workflow for when we want to tie element. So we're sending this in the orchestration layer. One of those little tasks is like, okay, call this workflow in Make. Send it the data that it needs based on that flow, and because it knows and it's connected to their Zoom account, it's actually going to it's going to kind of check in if the person exists in Zoom, yes or no, and it goes through that whole process of creating that account, and then it's actually returning that back to our orchestration layer, right, to the Daxter layer. So now we can take that data and continue that workflow. So essentially, we can now connect different pieces to anything. So it becomes very modular on how we're approaching it. So this is one of them, and then the other flow that we've added in here is the Google flow, which is a little bit more complex, right? So the Google flow, there's a lot of different components in here, but essentially we're calling the Google APIs to essentially say, okay, if there is a user, create that user, give me that user, create a group, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, we're kind of calling Daxter and calling Element back, right? So it becomes really, really easy for us to put something like this together. And the main part is that because we can now ask the Presidio group to say, hey, you have a Google account, don't give us those credentials, just go in here, log in with your Google account or with your Zoom admin account, and you authorize with it. Like, we don't need to care about that. We'll just, our layer will just call, this workflows and then handle everything else that we're doing. So it becomes really, really easy for us to kind of build this more complex integrations, right, that we're just talking about. All right, so that's the Google one. Let me go back in here, and I don't know if we have, so we have a couple other ones. It's like, well, they want, when the student actually gets created, they want to send an email out, which, of course, that makes sense. So we're actually implemented that as well in here. All right. Let me go back to, I want to stop here to see if there's any questions around this, because it's a pretty complex workflow, but our team was able to build it. Now we have all the building blocks of it, and we can make changes pretty quickly. We're maintaining it, meaning that it's being run on our infrastructure. There's very, very minimal involvement from the other side or from the other team, and there was no IT, required at all from their side, right? Essentially, all they had to do is give us credentials, log into those systems, and we handled all of the integration and handled all the data exchange and building the glue in between. The only requirement was obviously they had to tell us, okay, you need to do the testing. Is the data coming okay? Is the data not coming okay? So that was the only requirement on their side, or the only time commitment on their side. All right, is there any questions? I think I can show one or two more, but I want to stop here because this is a pretty complex one, right? And if you're thinking about having this kinds of workflows, you can ask us about it, and then we can probably solve that a little bit easier as we can orchestrate all those components together. You might be thinking, how do I bring data from my LMS? Or how do I create an LMS user if Canvas or somebody else has an account? Or how do I bring that data back into Element and then I do this other thing? So we can start talking about those types of integrations, and we're learning more and more and more about the workflows that you guys are using. So any questions about this? Okay. So the other part, of course, we have a lot of documentation, and I think I showed you that, but let me go through and go to one more example here, actually a couple examples. So with WakeTech, what we're doing is we're essentially using Ethos to go to bring both student data, majors, and other data to bring them into Element, and then vice versa. So again, that Daxter components that we're using here, I can now go back and let me open that up. So that graph looks very similar to kind of what you saw before, right? So what you're seeing here is like, okay, export student from Element, find or create an operation in Ethos, and then in parallel, we're running all of these other things, like we're creating or updating applications that are coming in, we're creating or updating education, other relative components, we're populating the student, and we're kind of saving identities. So all of these other operations are happening in parallel. To be honest, Ethos has been interesting for us because it requires everything to be everything needs to be its own kind of API call, so we have to put all these things together. We can't just send data to it and say, here, save all this data. We can do that to Element, right? Because we've architected it that way. So it becomes really easy from a developer to say, hey, I have a whole this bunch of data. Here it is. You figure it out how to save it in all these different objects and all these different places. And it becomes really easy because we have that layer. But some of the other systems, they're like, well, no, you have to call this first, and then this first, and then this second, and then you have to kind of put all those pieces together. So it's been a little bit of a learning curve for us. So not the greatest, but we've actually figured it out. So again, this is something very similar to what we talked about before. That graph, I can kind of you can take a look at it. This one is pretty easy, right? Well, easy compared, but when you take a look, let's see if we don't have any runs in here. But let me go and see if we have some other ones. We also have the element to ethos, ethos to element, so coming the other way around. And in this case, it's like we're getting that person. We're kind of bringing that person, getting addresses, getting applications, getting the education object. So a lot of this data, you can see now that we're getting a lot more pieces, after that. And then what we're doing here at the end is we're loading it into Element, right? So we're kind of sending and loading into Element. Let me open up one more, and this is Texas A&M San Antonio. The other part that we've done here is that we've built helpers for us to speed things up, right? Before, you had to export your data sources out of Element. You had to export files from your SIS to say, okay, these are my majors, these are my, these are my campuses or kind of translation tables. Well, we have a way to kind of extract all of that data now through our APIs, through Ethos, because we kind of abstracted all that away, and we can kind of keep it in sync with the Element data. So you don't have to, we can accelerate that implementation even further. I mean, Keith is here, but it takes weeks sometimes to get those translation tables into Element. So let me open this up. Here's one. Let me see if there's any runs. I don't think I have any runs in here right now. Oh, here we go. So we have some runs. So ethos to element graph. So you see all of these things happening. I can actually go in here and I can re-execute one of these. So you can actually take a look at how that works, right? So I can kind of zoom in a little bit more, and it will start that job. It will work together, and it will go through all of those different steps. But what I mentioned about visibility before is you know exactly what's happening, and there's history. You can go back and you can take a look at what happened, what went wrong, what data was sent. I can run specific items in that particular graph, so I can make sure that we're going through. So here we go. So now we start that whole process of everything going through, right? So it's getting the data. It's getting the data from Ethos, and it's taking a little bit longer. All right, there we go. So that completed. And let me zoom out so you can actually see all of the operations happening here, right? So as we go through, you can see that all the operations are happening. You can see all the data that's being pulled, how it's getting transformed down below. Of course, you're not going to necessarily want access to this, right? Or you're not going to necessarily have access or need to have access to this. But this is for us because now we give you the confidence to say, okay, when something goes wrong, we can go exactly at that point in time and say, okay, this is why it went wrong. This is exactly what happened. We have all this data, this visibility underneath. So anyway, so it's actually taking that run. It's going through multiple times, and it's pulling that data in. And because we're able to pull this data as it becomes available, we can now parallelize everything and can be more real time. So we don't have to go in and say, hey, we're going to run this every night. So this can run near real time, right? Because if Ethos doesn't have that available. On the element side, what we've done is that when we define particular actions or triggers, we can say every time an application is submitted, we're sending a message to this layer and saying, okay, trigger this workflow or trigger this integration, and then it will go in and then kind of run all that data, pull the data from Element, and then send it to the other system. I think with Ethos we have a kind of a change stream as well, so they publish when things are updated, and we can integrate the same thing. So this becomes real time now, right? So it becomes real time, and it works. It scales infinitely, right? So if 10 users are updating stuff, or if you have 100 or 1,000, all of those things are kind of running in parallel, and it's not taking, let's say, an hour. And we're using all of our APIs. So we're using we're dogfooding our own APIs, so to speak. So we're using all the APIs that are in that integration. We've been able to, this is what we're using here. All right, well, I think this task ran successfully, and we're good to go. Obviously, it took about 92 seconds, and a lot of that, if you saw, it has to do with how we're pulling those Ethos data together and kind of pulling those APIs. With that, I think we have a couple more things, but I know that we are way at time, and I wanted to talk about some of the other. So we have done some really interesting integrations around financial information, and we have added a Stripe. If you don't have your own payment processor in Element, now we have Stripe as a processor. So it's essentially going through our account. So you just go in, you connect Stripe. You don't have to have a Stripe account. It goes through us. Think about it as like an Element payment or something like that, right? You get your own sub account in there. You can manage all your transactions and everything else. You can do refunds, and then you can set up your, where those funding goes into your bank. So we're very happy about that. We've done PayPal integrations and Flywire as well. But I would really recommend trying to look at Stripe. We talked about Snowflake data sharing. I think Damien talked about that during our prior conversation. But what this allows us to do is essentially, of course, with integrations that we do, we take one user when the user does something, and then we have a predefined workflow of how we bring that user's data into some other system, or what kind of actions do we do. But what happens if you want to have all of those users, all the users' data, because you want to plug in your own BI tool or your own Tableau or whatever your team is using, and you want that data to be available now? Well, that's why we introduced Snowflake, right? So we talked about that during our product keynote. For those of you who are not, I should have gone a little bit into more detail about that, but find me afterwards if you need more data around it. So this is kind of the Snowflake architecture where they're able to give you guys, we're able to have providers and then have consumers, right? So those consumers can be, can basically, we can store the data in one place in our instance, and then we can give you read access to that data. So the data is not copied, is in real time. It's the same data that you're seeing on Insights, right? And then you can have access to everything in there as well. And you don't have to have your own Snowflake account. Like, we'll give you what are called reader accounts. And those accounts, essentially, they're under our account, right, under the Element account. But we can give you just, again, you have your own interface. You can log in and you can do whatever you need to do. But they're tied into the Element account, and you can only essentially connect that and read that data. So it becomes really, really easy to not have another contract, right? So that's the point there. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're at time. I kept you, actually, just at time. Look at that. Whew. And do we have any questions?
I quickly saw the score slide.
Yes.
And that's for?
Documents.
Yes. What about parchment?
We're working with parchment as well. So score and parchment. We've had, if you have any of these services, please bug them to say, can you integrate with Element? It makes our lives a lot easier when we try to talk to their product team, so they can prioritize talking to us and integrating with us, or giving us, some additional help, right? it becomes a lot easier when we do that. We are working on other integrations as well. If you use CAS, for example, we're working on a couple of proof of concepts on that, so we can bring that data directly in. That's similar to Common App, so we're working on that integration as well. Yeah.
Taking it probably slightly different just because of my role. Is there currently a seamless integration that you would recommend that allows students to like make appointments, so like with their admissions or advisors, counselors?
So I think you guys use Calendly, right? I think SEMO uses Calendly right now, and you have all your links, for example, going to Calendly, and you can essentially bring a lot of that data in if you want through either Zapier or that is one of the things that there's a gap right now in terms of calendaring. Again, we took the approach of, hey, tools like Calendly and some of the other ones that have been on the market, like they're innovating so much faster. We're like, okay, let's just, they're very inexpensive and they're providing a lot more features and a lot more integration. So you can actually connect with one of those tools. But at some point, we might have to say, okay, we need this feature internally as we move more towards full student, kind of the full student life cycle. But Calendly, I think, would be a good one. And Linnell, you're using Calendly at SEMO, right?
We used Calendly really heavily right when the pandemic hit. Now,
Got it.
our usage dropped so much that we didn't maintain it, but it was wonderful when we had it.
Got it.
So, and just you take out the back and forth, and they just directly see your availability. There's great rules to set up of, blocking different times out and things. So yeah, and it just seamlessly places it on your calendar for you, sends them reminders, sends you reminders.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really slick product as we were using it and filled a really great purpose.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, so this concludes the second day and the final day of Engage. Hope everybody's had a wonderful time. We thank you a lot for being here in person, and if you're online, thanks for watching. We'll be recording a lot of the sessions, and we'll make them available as well. So don't feel like you missed anything. We will for sure make those available. It will probably take us a few days to kind of put those together, but we will be sending everybody links to a lot of the sessions. If you have any questions, my team is all around here. You can kind of grab a card, follow up afterwards. But thanks again for being here and in person and making this really special first Engage conference. So thanks again.